I come to this work from a peace background. So I was very active in the Vietnam peace protest, and I was a young person at the time. And I think I experienced two things that really stuck with me through this work. The first is the importance of struggle coupled with persistence. You know, if you're going to make a difference, you can't assume that it's going to become easy. It's an iterative process. It's a long-term thing. You've got to have the passion and commitment to be in it for the long run. And the other thing that I learned was the agency of young people. And I'm happy to say in retrospect that it was the Vietnam protest that played a significant role in turning things around from a horribly illegitimate and destructive war. And it was, I remember vividly the images of children that came back from the use of Agent Orange and things like that, that really tore me up and made me ask, you know, what am I doing about this? And at the time, the answer was trying to help end this bloody war, but it also planted some seeds. In the 80s, started working with Palestinian refugees and became very interested in learning from Palestinian youth. And they taught me a lot. But the more I worked with them, the more I realized how agentic they were. And they told me in no uncertain terms how the NGOs and the governments of the world did not listen to them, and that even within their own society, they were relegated to a secondary status. And so I began sort of asking, well, what would happen if, you know, somehow we unleashed the enormous creativity to be found amongst young people? So fast forward once again, in the mid-1990s, I was living in Ashland, Virginia, teaching in a small private liberal arts college in Ashland, Randolph-Macon College. And down the road in Richmond, Christian Children's Fund had one of the larger programs on psychosocial support for war-affected children going in Angola. The Angolan War was, of course, very protracted, very bloody, and left lots of psychological as well as physical wounds. And they needed some help evaluating the program. And they asked me if I wanted to go to Angola to help with that. And I felt like a complete, utter imposter. I just looked in the mirror and I said, what are you even thinking of? You don't know anything about Angola. Never been to sub-Saharan Africa. You know, what kind of nonsense is this? But, you know, I was told that there was a very talented Angolan team, you know, that they would be willing to teach me a lot of things, and that I was going to be working with a medical anthropologist. What I found was really startling. First of all, it was really clear to me that the majority of children that we were looking at were not torn up and devastated by war. They were strongly affected, but they would play, they had positive relationships, many continued with education. They were problem solvers, they had peer relationships. And there were a number, of course, who needed specialized care, no question. But the NGOs that were there, including the program that I was there to work on, believed that the problem was PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That was the problem. But one day, a young girl whose family had been attacked, village had been attacked, and her family killed, she said, here we believe that the parents' spirits can't make transition to the realm of the ancestors. And so they're very angry and agitated, and they cause problems. So for her, what was needed for psychosocial well-being was a burial ritual, the obito. And I found myself thinking, you know, this is so cultural. And, you know, from the standpoint of Western psychology that I was trained in, I was trained to view that as superstitious behavior. But listening to Carlinda and listening to the local people, I thought, what could be more scientific than the principle that belief shapes behavior? We then launched, through Carlinda's courage, into a program of learning and documenting traditional healing, looking at traditional burial rituals, cleansing rituals, and so on. And we found a boy who was 14 who had been a former child soldier. And he said he had trouble sleeping at night. And, people began thinking, oh, he probably has PTSD. But Carlinda, again, had the presence of mind to ask, why can't you sleep at night? And he said, well, the spirit of the man I killed comes to me and asked, why'd you do this to me? And the belief was that that spirit was all powerful and could kill you, could even jump from your body into the body of a family member. And so this really challenged the idea of using Western psychology in a war zone where the culture was spiritualistic in its cosmology. Are we going to continue sort of imposing Western ideas on the rest of the world in a colonial fashion? Or are we going to be a little more humble? This whole idea of listening and empathy and really trying to learn about cultural practices without romanticizing. There were a lot of cultural practices we saw that were pretty dangerous as well. But all those came into play. And I'm happy to say that what this resulted in for me was a more holistic approach that was culturally grounded. What are the stresses related to not knowing where your family is? What's it like being a mother when you can't feed your family and knowing that certain members of your family are probably going to starve to death because there's a food insecurity? And what about the issue of stigma for former child soldiers, whom I worked with a lot? The usual problem that was looked at was PTSD. Every former child soldier I've ever talked with, including, especially girls, have said that stigma is by far their big issue. Social isolation, fear, and if you're a woman, the view that you're somehow sexually profligate, damaged goods, spiritually contaminated, and therefore to be isolated. In 2005, WHO had gone to the Interagency Standing Committee, the sort of highest policy setting body within the UN, and asked to develop some interagency guidelines. I would say through an intensive 2-year process, we examined our own dogmas. And I found this to be the single most important thing as a child protection worker. Each of us brings cherished assumptions that we can't even articulate. And it's threatening to challenge them. But we were in a context where I needed to step back from my love of holistic psychosocial support and listen to psychiatrists and clinical psychologists to talk about the people who really are torn up in war. And by the same token, they needed to step back and to stop thinking totally about disease models and medical models and to think about whole human beings and child rights. Since then, you'd be hard put to find an emergency that did not have significant attention to mental health and psychosocial support. One of the most significant parts of the mental health and psychosocial support guidelines in emergencies was the idea of self-help. It's not about what outsiders do necessarily, because the front line of support is to enable supports from family, from friends, from natural helpers, from faith communities, from spirits, if that's your belief system. How do we as outsiders engage with communities? We've talked about community-based child protection. It means almost anything under the sun. But in a 2009 global review that I helped to work on, we dug deep into the NGO and UN vaults, and we found that using the typology that John had developed, that by far the dominant approach was what might be called a light partnership approach. It's not a bad approach, and I don't mean to single it out for abuse. Just for the record, I've helped to establish quite a number of those communities. But what the review showed was that it generates low levels of ownership, low levels of sustainability, and at the end of the day, local people see it as an outside imposition. So the basic idea is to transform our role from that of expert to that of listener, co-learner, recognizing that the communities have tremendous assets for solving problems themselves. We create the space. We are facilitators and co-learners, but Communities decide what are the harms to children. Communities, through a long, slow, inclusive process of dialogue, they decide together which harm they want to address. Then they decide what action they want to take. And then they implement the action, and as they go, they reflect and they take stock of what's going well, what needs adjustment. The fact that it is communities taking the decisions leads to high levels of ownership. People do not see it as a project. They say, this is our process. These are our children. We're concerned about them, and out of that concern comes a felt sense of responsibility. We chose to take this action, and they're proud of it. And because they're dealing with children's issues, children naturally become leaders in the process. It goes way beyond participation. So suddenly, girls and boys who previously in their cultural system might have been seen as people to be seen and not heard, suddenly are seen as agents who are important in enabling communities to achieve their goals. I wanted to just close by saying I think the field of child protection has half a picture. We're not bad at response. We're world-class weak on prevention. And I want to throw down an ethical challenge for all generations, myself included. Isn't it an ethical imperative to prevent harms to children before they occur? Why on earth would we as child protection workers spend 90% of our time waiting for the horrible things to happen and then responding and trying to pick up the pieces? For me, this community-led process is interesting because it is stronger on prevention. At present, it's somewhat weaker on response. It's sort of the converse. And I also wanted to mention it's not a replacement for top-down. I think there are certain contexts where top-down approaches are absolutely necessary, if not even more effective. But I wanted to end with a very quick reflection on what's needed for the next generation. It's not the quick analysis. It's not the rapid response. Those things we know how to do. Those skills can be acquired. What's missing is humility, deep listening, real empathy, building trust, self-criticism, being able to reflect and hold up the mirror at the end of the day and do what Jean-Claude was inviting us to do and say, look, we're all finite human beings who have some ideas, but we're going to create a variety of problems. But what do we do with that? It's these soft skills, I think, that enable us to engage with, learn from, and make a difference with communities in a very different way. But in none of the graduate programs I know of, including my own, those really aren't part of the curriculum. And I can't name a child protection agency that in its HR departments and program really takes those seriously. But I think we need to take them seriously. Humility begins with the willingness to think that a lot of the things that I do and that each of us does may be more a product of the things that we were taught and maybe a product of our own assumptions, even arrogance of where we're positioned. It's the arrogance of charity. It's the arrogance of privilege. It's the arrogance of science. It's the arrogance of wanting to be a helper. But how can I help if I don't even know what is the context in which people are living? My efforts at helping may actually make the situation worse. Or by providing outside help, I may weaken supports that are already there. These are the questions and the issues that keep me up at night. My advice is lose lots of sleep, maybe think a little deeper if we can. So I'm going to stop there.
Thank you for the rich discussion, and I hope it continues.
I hope
I'd
so.
certainly like to
Yeah.
debate some of the points and discuss
Sure.
some of the points.